Hello and greetings from Kuala Lumpur. My name is Wendy Neo. I am the Emergency Wash Officer based at the IFRC Asia Pacific Regional Office. One of my main tasks at the regional office is providing technical support to national societies and IFRC Wash colleagues in country delegations and country cluster delegations. One of the ways that I do that is by carrying out technical review of all emergency operation documents to ensure quality and alignment of emergency wash activities in the region. Before we begin, there are two reasons why we have come up with this presentation, which accompanies the Wash Planning Tips document. As part of the Emergency Plan of Action EPOA package, there is a list of outcomes, outputs, and indicators covering different technical sectors and cross-cutting themes. For today, I'll be talking about the outcomes, outputs, and indicators that are specific to WASH, and we'll also be highlighting some key sections in the EPOA which requires WASH inputs. I'll be giving some tips along the way, which I hope will be useful for all of you when planning WASH activities in an emergency. We hope that with this presentation, your EPOA will get approved with as little comments as possible from the technical team members and as fast as possible so that your national society can begin activities on the ground. Let's take a look at the WASH outcomes and outputs, starting with WASH Outcome 1, which is the immediate reduction in risk of waterborne and water-related diseases in targeted communities. The keyword here being immediate reduction. This outcome should be selected if you are doing short-term emergency WASH activities that fulfills immediate needs. Under WASH Outcome 1, there are 5 outputs, each with a specific focus area. Output 1.1 relates to assessment of WASH situation, 1.2 to the provision of safe water, 1.3 to the provision of sanitation facilities, 1.4 to hygiene promotion activities, and lastly, output 1.5 relates to the provision of hygiene goods and training on how to use those goods. WASH Outcome 2 has 4 outputs, similarly each with a specific focus area. This outcome leans towards developmental or sustainable context. So if you are planning for longer term activities that fulfills needs in the longer run, Outcome 2 should be selected. WASH Outcome 2 reads as sustainable reduction in risk of waterborne and water-related diseases in targeted communities in the recovery phase. Keywords here being sustainable reduction and recovery phase. Output 2.1 relates to continuous monitoring and evaluation of WASH situation. 2.2 is about access of safe water through community-managed water sources. 2.3 relates to access and use of sanitation facilities. And lastly, output 2.4 relates to hygiene promotion. You may notice that for Outcome 2, there is no output related to distribution of hygiene goods, as we assume there is only such needs in the immediate few weeks after the disaster. But having said that, there are exceptions to this. For example, the population movement operation in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. This is a multi-year operation which continues to carry out hygiene promotion activities together with distribution of hygiene kits and top-up kits. This is a specific case with a special set of circumstances. Just to recap some of the key points that I have covered in the previous slide. Outcome 1 is selected when you're planning shorter-term emergency WASH activities that fulfills immediate WASH needs, while Outcome 2 is selected when you're planning longer-term WASH activities that are more sustainable, that fulfills WASH needs in the longer run. If you are doing both short and long-term activities, then you will need to select both outcomes and the relevant outputs. Not all outputs will be applicable to the emergency operation. National society only need to select those that are relevant to the context. Ensure the correct output is selected. If the national society is planning to carry out, for example, distribution of safe water, then output 1.2 should be selected. Or if there are plans to carry out distribution of hygiene items, then output 1.5 should be selected. Logically, if output 1.5 is selected, you should also be thinking about doing hygiene promotion activities, which means output 1.4 should be there as well. Do not change the wordings of the existing outcomes and outputs or create new ones unless there is an absolute need to do so. This standard list exists to ensure consistency across all regions. Note that changes or additions may delay the approval process of your DREF or emergency appeal. Before we go through all of the WASH outcomes, outputs, activities, indicators, and targets, let us see what do we mean when we say those terms. When we plan to do something, we first think about the outcome. What is the primary result that we want to achieve? So you can say that an outcome is the big picture. And how do you achieve this outcome then? It's by having outputs which are tangible products, goods, and services. And how do you achieve those outputs? It is by carrying out activities which are a collection of tasks to be carried out to achieve an output. Once you have your outcomes, outputs, and activities, we need a method to know whether are we meeting our outcomes and outputs or not. That is where indicators and targets come in. An indicator helps determine what progress is being made towards achieving your intended results, while a target is the measure of each indicator. You must have indicators and targets for each selected outcome and output. Now, let us go through outcome 1 and its outputs, indicators, and activities. You can refer to the WASH Planning Tips document, which has all of these written down. But I would just like to quickly go through this slide and the next few slides to highlight a few key points. So here's outcome 1. We know that we select this outcome when we are planning short-term emergency WASH activities that fulfills immediate needs. Under this outcome, we have a list of indicators that we can choose from, which is what we call as outcome level indicators. There are indicators related to water, sanitation, and hygiene. National Society only select ones that are applicable to the emergency operation. Just as a quick recap, there are 5 outputs under outcome 1, each with its specific topic or sub-area. Under each output, we have a standard list of indicators and activities that can be chosen from. Once again, National Society only choose the ones that are relevant and applicable to the emergency operations. Let's take a quick look at output 1.1, which relates to assessment, where you can see an indicator and 4 possible activities to choose from. Remember, for every indicator that is selected, there should be a target to measure the degree of achievement of that particular indicator. The same for output 1.2 for water supply, where there is a list of output level indicators and activities to choose from. There are different units of indicators available. National Society can opt to monitor number of people receiving safe water, or the amount of water distributed, so on and so forth. Select the ones most appropriate and feasible to be monitored, recorded, and reported. The same goes for the activities. Note that for parts stated as XX, those parts will need to be filled in when completing the EPOA. A quick tip or reminder: no distribution without training, a mantra that all WASH practitioners should always keep in mind. If there is a plan to distribute water treatment products, such as chlorine tablets, remember to also include training of the recipients on how to properly use these chemical products. If the technical team do not see any element of education or orientation with the distribution activities, that raises a red flag during the technical review process. By now, you should already notice that for every output, there is a list of indicators and activities to choose from. It's the same with output 1.3 here, which relates to sanitation. Similarly, choose the indicators and activities which are most appropriate to the situation. Based on my experience reviewing and providing comments to EPOAs, sanitation is by far the least selected and rollout activities by national societies. While we understand there may be various reasons behind this, we urge national societies to include more sanitation activities in emergency operations. Water and hygiene are often seen as more immediate needs. However, all elements are required to maintain and improve health and dignity. If sanitation was identified as a need, but not being fulfilled or addressed by the National Society, mention those reasonings or rationale in the EPUA so that the technical team is aware that the National Society has considered all factors. Outputs 1.4 and 1.5 are by far the most commonly selected outputs. Understandably so, since many national societies carry out hygiene promotion activities coupled with distribution of hygiene-related goods. Similarly, choose what is applicable. When National Society plan for hygiene promotion activities, consider other accompanying activities, such as training of volunteers, so that they are well versed in hygiene promotion topics common to the affected areas. Or consider distributing IEC materials which are suited to the targeted affected populations. Note that under this output, you can also choose to include construction and maintenance of hand washing facilities. So this output does not only include the more traditional hygiene promotion activities, but also hardware-natured activities. Output 1.5 is on distribution of hygiene-related goods. In an emergency operation, when there is output 1.5, there should also be inclusion of hygiene promotion activities, which is output 1.4, and vice versa. Therefore, most of the time in most emergencies, these two outputs should go hand in hand. Another important point is when there is distribution of hygiene kits, there must be a training or orientation component. Therefore, this activity should always be selected. Remember the mantra that I mentioned earlier and say it with me. No distribution without training. Now, another mantra that we have to keep in mind as WASH practitioners is no distribution without monitoring. With any item distribution, be it water treatment products or hygiene goods, we should aim to carry out some form of monitoring activity after each distribution run. For example, in the case of distribution of hygiene kits, National Society should carry out a post-distribution monitoring, or at least carry out some household-level surveys to get feedback on the items distributed, so that the National Society can learn from the first distribution round and use those learnings to inform subsequent distributions. So remember to include such activities when drafting the EPUA. Let's move on to outcome 2. Just as a reminder again, this outcome should be selected when you're planning longer-term emergency WASH activities. Similar to outcome 1, there is a list of outcome level indicators that can be chosen from, each focusing on different subtopics or areas, such as safe water services, treatment and safe use of wastewater, hygiene promotion, so on and so forth. Select what is most appropriate and relevant to the context. Output 2.1 is about monitoring and evaluation. There is an indicator that you can opt to select and 4 activities to choose from. Output 2.2 is about community-managed water sources. The indicators and activities all imply longer-term water supply solutions. So if you're planning to do, for example, community-level rainwater harvesting systems or gravity-fed systems, you can opt to select this output. Similarly, the XX in the activity should be completed if they are selected in the EPUA. Output 2.3 relates to providing access to and use of sanitation. Similarly, the indicators and activities all imply longer-term and improved sanitation solutions. If there is a plan to build flood-resistant household latrines, for example, then this output should be selected. Fill in the XX if any of these activities are selected in the EPUA. Lastly, output 2.4 is on hygiene promotion activities. You may notice that the indicators and activities look quite the same with those stated under output 1.4, but there are small differences. For example, the scope of output 1.4 is smaller, as it mentions hygiene promotion activities for target population, while output 2.4 mentions hygiene promotion activities for the entire affected population, thereby indicating a larger coverage of people. Under output 2.4, one of the suggested activities is conducting baseline survey, which is an activity suggesting something longer term. While under output 1.4, there is no such activity. Instead, there is one on needs assessment, which is an activity commonly carried out during the initial stages of an emergency. Therefore, just by going through the list of activities, we can also gauge which output to go for. It is not only important to know and be well briefed on the different outcomes, outputs, and indicators that are available for national societies to choose from, but it is also critical to pay attention to a few key sections in the EPOA, which the technical team often focus on. Take a look here at the different sections that we look out for, which are sections that contain the summary of the current response, needs analysis, operational strategy, and detailed operational plan. And we also take notice how the EPOA relates to the budget. Overall, what the technical team is looking for is consistency of information and how they all relate to one another, not only between the different sections in the EPOA, but also between the EPOA with the budget. Now let's go through one by one. In a summary of the current response, which you can find on page 2 of the EPOA template, this is where the National Society provides a summary of their response plan, and also to mention what are the actions of non-Red Cross, Red Crescent actors on the ground. This is important because if the National Society is not planning to address some of the identified needs, it is crucial for the technical team to know how these needs are being addressed on the ground, either via the government or other organizations. In the needs analysis section on page 3 of the EPOA template, this is where immediate and potential needs are detailed, as well as information on the targeted areas and populations, extent of damages, scenario planning, and operation risk assessment. In the operational strategy section on page 4 of the EPOA template, the objectives of the operation and the proposed strategy should be stated, as well as information on support services. And last but definitely not the least, we have the detailed operational plan on page 6 of the EPOA template, where the National Society response plan is laid out in details, and where we will find the selected outcomes, outputs, indicators, activities, and targets. Under the section on detailed operational plan, I would like to highlight about a heading called Program Standards or Benchmarks, where National Society outlines some of the key standards or benchmarks taken as a guidance or reference while planning and implementing activities. Sphere and WHO standards are usually commonly mentioned, but just to highlight that there are other WASH standards or benchmarks that can be referenced, such as the WASH Guidelines for Hygiene Promotion in Emergency Operations, the Menstrual Hygiene Management Guideline and Tools, and the Household Water Treatment and Safe Storage Field Manual. I hope all of this sounds familiar to you, but if not, all these materials can be found on www.watsanmissionassistant.org. This is just to highlight the importance of keeping track of new standards or benchmarks, especially ones that are published by the IFRC. Just to recap and reiterate, the information mentioned in the different sections should be consistent, meaning if provision of drinking water is mentioned under summary of current response, then the same should be reflected in the needs analysis, operational strategy, and under the detailed operational plan. Consistency of information is not only important in these sections in the EPOA, but also has to correlate with the budget. For example, if the National Society is planning to provide safe drinking water to the affected population through deployment of water treatment plants, then these costs and all associated costs should be reflected in the budget. Meaning in this case, I will look out for budget lines or costs relating to the deployment of the plants, mobilization of volunteers and potentially training of the volunteers, and monitoring of the use and storage of water at the household level. All of these costs should be reflected in the budget and in cases where this is not seen, comments will be placed to alert the country team. Now, after talking about all the WASH outcomes, outputs, and indicators, let's now take a look at some real examples, just to highlight some of the more common red flags seen in emergency operation documents. This first example is taken from a final report of a tropical cyclone operation. You may notice that there are 6 indicators under output 1.1, and most of them are not taken from the standard list of indicators. We understand that in some cases there may be a need to create new indicators, but when you do so, you run the risk of not being aligned to the globally accepted and recommended list. The high number of indicators seen here is also a risk to the National Society. Remember, the more indicators adopted by the National Society, the more work it is for the National Society to monitor, record, and report. Therefore, select meaningful indicators that best measure the progress of activities, outputs, and outcomes. This next example is taken from an EPOA of a floods operation. There are several issues here. Firstly, the activities are heavy on hygiene component. Although it was mentioned under needs analysis section that sanitation needs are being addressed by the government authorities, there are no indication of water gaps or needs and how this EPOA is addressing that. In addition, activities mentioned here are not taken from the standard list and are also missing some key accompanying activities. For example, hygiene promotion activities should be accompanied with needs assessment and selection of target groups, key messages and communication methods, and potentially also training of volunteers. But in this case, none of these activities were mentioned under output 1.4. Output 1.5 is also missing a few key activities, for example, training or orientation and monitoring of the use of hygiene kits. Remember what was mentioned earlier, no distribution without training and monitoring. Lastly, the order of output is also incorrect, where output 1.4 should be mentioned first, followed by output 1.5. This was taken from a final report of a floods operation. We can see here that there is a great imbalance between the number of people reached with hygiene promotion activities, which is 37,500 people, compared to the number of people reached with safe water and hygiene kits, which is only 1,500 households, equivalent to 7,500 people. Ideally, we should have a healthier balance, but in cases where the National Society is not capable of doing so, this has to be explained in the EPOA. This last example comes from an operation update of a flood response. Again, we see that indicators were not taken from the standard recommended list. For example, number of wells cleaned. Instead, a more meaningful indicator would be to state the number of people or households expected to benefit from this intervention. Reporting that 600 wells have been cleaned does not necessarily mean that those wells are being utilized on the ground. Another mistake here is cleanup campaigns should come under output 1.3, relating to sanitation, and should not be under output 1.4, which is to do with hygiene promotion. Always refer to the standard list of outcomes, outputs, and activities. This list exists to ensure that you don't have to create new ones, but instead to use it to make the process of writing up the EPOA a much faster and easier one. In conclusion, allow me to recap some of the key points to consider and incorporate when working on future EPOAs. Planned activities of an emergency operation should address and relate to needs on the ground. For example, if sanitation was found as a need resulting from an assessment, there should be relevant and appropriate sanitation activities planned to address those needs. If these needs are being covered by the government and/or other organizations, this should be mentioned in the EPOA. It will raise a red flag to the technical team if we see a need being identified but not addressed in the EPOA in any way. If the time frame of the emergency operation is rather long, for example 6 to 12 months, consider incorporating longer-term WASH solutions. in addition to fulfilling immediate wash needs of those affected. Having the backing of an emergency appeal is a great opportunity to further develop and strengthen the capacity of national society, which otherwise may not be possible. Ensure a balance of wash support between the components of water, sanitation, and hygiene. For example, number of sanitation recipients should match the number of water recipients. If there are any constraints from achieving a balanced wash support and intervention, this should be mentioned in the EPUA. Ensure balance of hardware and software support. For example, when there is a plan to distribute hygiene items, it should be coupled with hygiene promotion activities, which should not only include key hygiene messages, but also orientation on the content of the hygiene kit and how to use those hygiene items. Remember, one of the mantras of WASH is no distribution without training. Ensure distribution of goods is followed up with a post-distribution monitoring activity. This is to ensure that we learn from the first rounds of distribution and incorporate or reflect those learnings before we carry out subsequent distributions. Consider the use of cash and voucher assistance. Cash can be incorporated into WASH activities in numerous ways. For example, distributing cash to purchase hygiene items rather than distributing hygiene kits, or paying local laborers to dig latrine pits or to clean up wells. I thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions to any of the points mentioned in this presentation or have questions relating to planning of emergency WASH activities, feel free to drop me a line. My email address is as seen here. Take care and stay safe.